breakfast this week.
I know. Well, you
Now,
need it.
I do drink a lot of water.
You need it. It's amazing.
It's actually mad the stage. It's
More
so
teachers.
dangerous.
More
Oh, really?
teachers. I recognise the teachers. Sylvia Bean. Sylvia used to choreograph the dances in all the operas in the 60s in the Gaiety.
And Emma Martin's teacher, Claire.
It was brilliant. The opera company used to call Pauline was in Aida and Rigoletto and Trovatore and Pavarotti.
Madam was in
Mavis
Aida.
Oh yeah.
There's a lovely photograph of
The
her
Nubian.
as the principal dancer. Yeah. I think she did her own choreography for it. As the Beecham
Talking about
seasons.
She probably
Pauline
improved.
and the other dancers
Maybe,
used
maybe.
to hired to do the operas in the 60s in the Gaiety, Aida and regular, and the lead tenor was sick, just couldn't perform, and they rang Italy and they said, have you got a young tenor? There's a guy here, he's 18, he's quite good. Pavarotti.
Gosh,
Yeah.
goodness.
Because nobody knew who they were working with. 1963 or
But
4.
Cork claimed to have done even better. They claimed that Pavarotti came with his father to the choral festival years before that.
We must have been about 12 then.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can always...
Father was
Cultural
in
capital.
Yeah, yeah. I know somebody told me once they built a theatre in
This is not
Southsea,
this one,
and they would have been 15, and I played
the
Southsea, and there was
The Kings
Yeah.
on
just
the
the
corner.
Kings, and that's right, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so that's for Fontaine and Ashton, and I'm sure that the first one is for Rombert
Did you come to
and
our...
somebody else. I can't think who.
Is that the first one?
No.
No.
Is this something that
Anyway, it is
they
Rombert.
were reading yesterday, which is
Who
quite
else would
interesting.
it be?
It's when she revisits
Yes, that would have
multiples.
been the years before.
55.
She didn't go on that trip.
One of Pauline's girls went to Rombert.
Really?
Lisa McLaughlin, she's now lead dancer with Cush Kane.
Which was the thing that she precipitated.
Fantastic.
She came back, she's got a career here. No, it's spasmodic because they only perform, 2 or 3 times a year.
Yeah.
They did a fab... Now, I'm not a devotee of modernising
I think we're on now.
any theatre, but
Welcome to this roundtable discussion on Ninette and Valois. Before I can begin, I'm just going to give you a few housekeeping. If you could please make sure that your mobile phones are now turned off. Right, we have to show you the choir entrance. We have one located at the back of the stage. We have 2 at the downstage, one on your right and one on your left. We also have one up at the back of the stairs and then out to the door on your left. If at any point you need to use the toilet, we ask that you go up the stairs and out the door to the left, so that you don't come down onto the stage. There will be no interval, so it's going to run for about an hour or so. And thank you very much, and hope you enjoy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon rather. You're very welcome to the Tramway Theatre on this very auspicious occasion. My name is Lawrence Foster. I'm Chairman of Interpretive Artists Ireland, who in collaboration with the Blessington Forum have helped to put on this fabulous festival this week. Unfortunately, one of our guest speakers, Paul Johnson, Director of Dance Ireland, due to circumstances beyond his control, cannot be here, so I'm going to try and step into his capacious boots. We have with us a distinguished panel of practitioners who are going to enlighten us with their expertise and knowledge of all things terpsichorean. And our eminent chairperson today in the centre is Anne McCarr. Anne was RTE Television Senior Features Producer, a former chair of the Pre-Italia television panels, and director of the RTE television documentary Come and Dance With Me in Ireland, which Anne produced with Madame for Ninette's 99th birthday. She is joined on her right by Joanna Banks. Joanna trained at the Royal Ballet School, joining the Royal Ballet on graduation. Subsequently, she performed worldwide with Canadian National Ballet, Bateau d'Or in Israel, Munich State Ballet, and Ballet Rombert. After joining Irish National Ballet as a soloist and principal, Joanna became founder member of Dance Island and continues to perform. Our special guest is Anna Meadmore. Anna trained at Elmhurst Ballet School, pursued a varied career as a professional dancer and teacher, and from 1997 has been responsible for the care and management of the Royal Ballet School's special collections and also curator of the White Lodge Museum. And last but no means least, Stephen G. Brennan. And Stephen is choreographer and educational arts officer with Ballet Ireland, having danced for them since 1999. Stephen graduated from the Central School of Ballet London and danced with many of Europe's ballet companies, including the London Ballet Theatre, Malmö Ballet, the National Norwegian and Scottish Ballets, and he is also a board member of Irish Ballet Forum. Please welcome them. And now, before we begin, we're going to evoke, literally, the spirit and sound of Dame Ninette as we bring you a short interview which you may find very interesting. It's his audio.
She's now in her 90s and still known in her own world as Madam. But you were said to be the mistress of the single withering sentence, is that right?
I don't know. I'm afraid I haven't kept a list of any of my sentences. Perhaps it's a very good thing.
Now, what is it that would make you angry and come out with one of those sentences?
Oh, it's very difficult to say. It's the reaction of them to correction, or whether they're too sure of themselves or if they're not very sure of themselves. You can't give a direct answer to the various temperaments you come into contact with. You've got to learn about each temperament and make the necessary compassionate outlook to them, because there are not two dancers that are the same.
So do you recognise it now, when you go to the ballet or go to the schools, do you recognise the performers and the work as creatures of your making, or has it all changed dramatically since?
No, it hasn't changed dramatically. There's been the natural development in the ballet world, as there is in everything else in life as you move from one century to the other. And over a period of 50, 60 years, you must expect changes, and I get rather irritated when people won't accept them. Keep saying to me, oh, we only want to see the old ballets, how lovely they were. Of course they were lovely to us then, those days. They were our generation and time. And it's quite wrong also to say that if they don't dance them as well as we did, that they're not as good. It's got nothing to do with it. They're another generation, and their works, well, we wouldn't be able to tackle what they're doing. So it's mutual.
It's rare, Dame Ninette, to read or hear about ballet these days without very quickly coming across the word pain, the image of the smiling mask hiding the agony of the cramped muscles. Do the two things naturally go hand in hand, ballet and pain?
Well, to a certain extent, I think it's the life of an athlete. We have to accept that. And we know what athletes have to put up with, and dancers have to put up with very similar troubles. I think it's true to point. I think it's all getting a little bit exaggerated now, and people are making more of it than it's necessary to. But it is a very dangerous career physically, for dancers have got to realise that they can have accidents that are not so serious as accidents to the ordinary person, but may bring their particular career to an entire standstill. I had a spine trouble, and I'd had infantile paralysis, which I didn't know I'd had as a child, and it had affected my back. Consequently, I did have pain, but they didn't know much in those days, you see, about those sort of things. As soon as they discovered what was wrong with me, I decided I was going to change and I would teach.
You earned a living at the age of 14, Dame Ninette, I think, performing your own version of The Dying Swan, didn't you?
Oh, no, I copied it most carefully from Pavlova. I went and stood at the back of the circle and wrote it all down, step by step.
But where did you perform it?
In a children's company called the Wonder Children. We were taken out on tour. I always say that I have danced The Dying Swan on every pier in England before the First World War.
Didn't they call you the miniature Pavlova?
Yes.
What name were you using at this point?
Same name.
Ninette de Valois.
That's right.
Where did you get that name from? Because that wasn't your real name, was
it? Well, it's a long story. It's a part of my French blood coming in, going back a long way. My mother suggested I should use it.
And your real name?
Stanus, it was. Stanus, Stanus, Irish name.
And your Christian name?
Idris, E-D-R-I-S.
And has anyone in your adult life ever called you that since you became Ninette de Valois?
Of course, hundreds of people.
Do your friends still call you Idris?
Naturally, yes. All my relations.
You were born just before the turn of the century in County Wicklow. Did you believe you were born to be a dancer? How early did you know?
No, I never gave it a thought. There's no reason why I should. I learnt an Irish jig when I was over there, which I insisted on dancing at a party once when I was very small. But outside that, the idea of being a dancer never entered my head.
So it was an Irish jig that was the first thing you stood up in
Yes.
public and danced? How old would you have been when you did that?
Oh, very young, I suppose about 7. I hadn't been to a dancing class. I'd been taught it by one of the peasants in my father's estate. And it was a children's party I was at. I'd never danced to a piano, and there was a pianist there who just played a skirt dance for another girl. So I said I'd like to do my jig. If she played, the lady would stay at the piano. That was the first time I'd ever danced music. I didn't notice to think of anything but the fact that at last I'd got some music to dance to.
Tell me about Diaghilev, because you worked for him for 2 years in the early 20s, didn't you?
Well, he was a very overawing gentleman. He was very intelligent. He was very critical of everything and everybody. He demanded perfection in every direction. He was a very frightening man, very disciplined. He was very, very strict. Yes, complete perfectionist.
What, of course, you also developed in your 2 years at the Ballet Russe was a resolve to establish a balletic tradition here in England.
Yes, I wanted to learn and then come away from it all and do something on my own.
Strange to think that the ballet was so neglected in this country.
Well, it wasn't strange because you knew about that when you left. You only left because there wasn't anything in your own country to do. So when you came back, you just came back thinking you would do something about it. It wasn't strange to you. You were used to having nothing in England, and you just made up your mind that you were going to do something about it.
How did you manage financially?
Well, it was very difficult. Lillian Bayliss had very little money. Well, the usual struggle, the usual English struggle in the theatre world. And in those days, of course, there were no subsidies. We had to entirely rely on charity.
So artistic achievement and money were not linked then, any more than they are today?
Oh, good heavens, no. Never.
But what you wanted to do was to establish an English style and tradition of ballet
yes,
as well,
naturally.
wasn't it? Well, how was that to be distinctive from the Russian style of ballet and the French style?
Well, I don't know quite how you can explain a thing like that. You just train all the talent in the country and something of your own character comes out in it, the country's personality and a musical approach and everything. I mean, it's native, that's all. It's just like difference. You don't explain the difference between England and France, you accept it. One passed on one's knowledge, but one also accepted the knowledge of other people. I always say in the end, it's a struggle you enjoy most.
And have you ever had a more exciting time since?
No, definitely not.
Dame Ninette de Valois, thank you very much indeed.
At the end of that interview, she was asked if she was on a desert island, what luxury item would she like? And she said, an endless supply of sleeping tablets. Very interesting. I will now hand you over to our chair, Anne McCowan.
Well, I think we should start with Joanna Banks because she has the closest link with Dame Ninette, having trained with her entirely in her ballet school. Joanna, would you like to talk about her?
Well, I consider myself extraordinarily lucky. I didn't realise it, obviously, as an 8-year-old when I presented myself for an audition for what was then the Sadler's Ballet School. Madam was, of course, at the audition, and one was very aware of an amazing presence behind this table. And I was lucky, I was selected, I became a junior associate, I did that for 3 years, and then after another audition, of course, Madam there again, and being a little bit more nervous because I was beginning to realise who this amazing woman was, I was accepted for the full-time school, which at that time wasn't in the luxurious premises in White Lodge. It was in West Kensington, Barons Court. I loved it because the senior school was there, the company were in and out rehearsing. It was an absolute hive of everything happening. And Madam was very much hands-on with that school. She didn't actually teach me at that stage, but she had a very good rota of teachers in the school. My best teacher probably was Winifred Edwards, who had been a member of Powerful's company, and I know that de Valois had headhunted Miss Edwards, and she was an amazing teacher. Also the syllabus, there's a lot of misconception about this, but the syllabus that we had in those days, which would have been 1951 roughly through till 1955 when I was there, was actually Madam's syllabus. It was a sort of amalgam of the Russian teachers that she had worked with. She was very heavily influenced by Cicchetti, but she also realized that that didn't cover everything. So her syllabus, we worked Monday through Thursday. Beautiful classes, I mean, just perfect. Nobody seemed to get injured because it was a gradual build-up. We had class every day. It was a gradual build-up of technical strength. And then on the Friday, you had a full-blown Cicchetti class, and I can just remember the long adages on three-quarter point, which I liked because I quite liked standing on three-quarter point. I've got a good flat three-quarter point, so it's quite easy for me to be up there and balance, and other people find it more difficult, so I was quite chuffed with all that. But the main thing was that we were very stringently assessed, because Madam saw absolutely no point in training people who weren't possibly going to have a future as a classical dancer. And so every year after Christmas, early on in that term, the door would open and the entourage would come in, and Madam, along with other prestigious teachers from the school, would watch class for a week. And that was frightening because we all knew that if we didn't come up to scratch, our parents would get a letter before Easter and we would be gone. We would be rigorously out. And I think it gives you an idea of how rigorous it was if I tell you that I started off in a class with 24 other young ladies, and by the time I graduated into the senior school, we were down to 12, so it was a 50% annihilation. And it wasn't done in a vindictive way. It was done as Madam, it was a very practical lady, it was done in a practical way. She knew these people weren't going to make it into the company, and therefore she felt that it would be cruel and unkind to encourage them to do something that they weren't going to be able to do. I was also very lucky because her syllabus was demonstrated. She did a summer school every summer, and that syllabus was demonstrated to teachers that came from all over the world, from Australia, Canada, the length and breadth. And out of each class, I think 6 of us were chosen to demonstrate that particular syllabus. And it was wonderful because we got extra coaching, and we had to stay on in July after the school had finished and demonstrate the syllabus. And I'd like to give an idea of Madam as an amazing lady, but also as a wonderful human being, because here was this internationally famous director and teacher covering the summer school, but she never forgot that we had given up a little bit of our summer holiday, and in the lunch break when we would be out in the back garden at Collett Gardens, she would always come out, and all of a sudden there was this lovely lady saying, you know, are you all right? Have you got enough lunch? You know, she became a family person, and it was a lovely side to her, which I actually saw later when I was on tour with the company. And she came on tour when I was with the touring company to Leeds. It was miserable winter weather, and we were all quite sick. And Madam had come up to see how Kenneth Macmillan was actually getting on with some rehearsals. But she noticed that we were all ill, and we had a matinee the following day. And all of a sudden, before the 2:30 matinee, Madam appeared with a huge bag from Boots the chemist. And I think she bought up every cough linctus and lozenge there was in the whole of Leeds, because she knew that we hadn't got understudies, we had to go on and dance, and she was, you know, looking after us. So I think we have to remember Madam as an incredibly rounded person. She was this amazing person with such strength and this aura, but she was very human underneath it all, and also a very, very private person. I mean, she went home to Sunningdale on the train from Waterloo in the evenings, and nobody knew anything about her private life at all, and I think rightly so. I think she would have hated Facebook and all the things of the modern generation. But no, she was an amazing lady. I mean, I didn't realize at the time, but I'm so lucky to have actually worked with her. And she was also very, very supportive of anything that was happening in Ireland, because years later, when I'd literally been all over the world, I came to Ireland in '74 and performed with Joan Denise Moriarty's professional company, the Irish National Ballet. And I think it must have been about '76, Madame came over. Hans Brenner had just reproduced La Ventana, the Bournonville piece for us, and Madame appeared for the season in Cork Opera House. And I thought, look, there's so much water under the bridge. She is not going to remember me. I'm not important. But she actually did remember me from the summer schools, and we had a lovely chat. And she was so excited that, you know, things were beginning to happen in Ireland. And later, when I had a school there, I was actually in touch with her through her secretary until about a year before she died. And she was so full of enthusiasm, encouragement, a truly wonderful lady. And I think Ireland needs to rediscover this amazing woman and pay far more tribute to her.
Thank you, Joanna. That gives a terrific portrait. If there's anybody who wants to join in at any stage, please do, but there is a microphone somewhere, which you will need because we're being recorded. So in order to have you on the recording, we will need that. However, in the meantime, shall I go on?
Can I just say something?
Yeah, yes.
I'm worried about the sleeping.
Can you just hang on for the microphone?
What is sleeping tablets? I always thought she was thinking about aspirin.
No, it is sleeping tablets. Yeah, because I was very struck by it as well. Yeah.
She had terrible headaches.
She had terrible headaches, yeah.
Migraines.
Yeah.
But do not think perhaps it was a little joke too?
It might have been.
A bit
That
right.
she would have been bored on a desert
Absolutely,
island with nobody to
absolutely.
choreograph.
Yes, you're quite right.
Is,
Yeah.
is
a
there
bit
anyone
right.
else has experience of meeting Madam?
I wasn't actually involved in the demonstration, but Claire probably wouldn't care. Others will probably know quite a bit about that because there was a demonstration by the Royal Academy Dancing in children at the Grand Room in Dublin in the Mansion House. So perhaps Claire will tell us a little bit about that.
I don't remember that one, but I do remember she came to give classes.
Sorry, wait for the microphone.
Okay. She came to give classes with the Royal Academy. It could have been around the same time. But I remember she chose Jared and Morris to go to the Royal Ballet at that stage. She was with, oh gosh, I can't remember the name. It's the National Ballet School. That's way back then. Yeah. Way back, maybe in the 50s, I think. And then she came again for the Ballet Club. That was in Juries, which is now gone to. Yes. But she was very encouraging when we had the Ballet Club. Really encouraging. But Ballet Club is now extinct. But I think that's because the Irish Ballet Company started. And so I think that's why the Ballet Club really went.
Anyone else? Yes? Where did her being called Madam arise?
I think it happened quite early on. I think it was one of the male dancers,
Yeah.
probably jokingly. Is it Gordon Hamilton? I believe.
I think
It's in the book.
Or Peter Clegg. I think several people claim
I'm sure
that it
several people
happened at
claim it,
different
but I mean,
times.
it just was right.
Yeah. But what's interesting about that is, you're absolutely right, it seems to have started as a bit of a dig in the ribs in a way.
Yes, I think so.
And yet she turned it round to her own advantage.
Oh, absolutely.
She took ownership of it. She could have seen it as her company sort of distancing her, but actually she took ownership of that and made it something very positive.
Oh, absolutely.
I think there's also a good parallel because when people talk about ballet masters and people talk about maestro, Cecchetti was always referred
Yeah,
to as
maestro,
maestro.
exactly.
And a ballet master wasn't just a teacher. A ballet master was someone who knew the trade, knew about choreography, knew how to arrange things. And so kind of a female equivalent of maestro, ballet master, as opposed to more than a teacher, more than a choreographer.
Absolutely.
So Balanchine chose master as his title as opposed to choreographer.
Ballet master, yeah.
And I think that has a parallel there,
yeah,
Madame
definitely.
Maestro.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And Rambert was called Madame Rambert too, but she wasn't just called Madame.
Madame, no.
No.
And that soon got sort of shortened to Mim.
Right, yeah.
Which you
whereas-
didn't say to her face, incidentally.
No, I'm sure. I'm sure not.
Very
Yes.
definitely not.
So
I
what
worked with her.
did you address her as Madame Rambert?
You didn't address her, actually. I mean, she commanded huge respect. And obviously she was known as Mim behind, and she knew she was known as Mim.
Yeah.
But,
I had 12 months in Birmingham with Madame Helene Lemiski at Birmingham Theatre School. Ballet and contemporary dance was compulsory, along with fencing, which was terrific. And she was always Madame Lemiski.
Yes, I think there's an environment at that time where it is Madame. However, with de Valois, it is particularly now associated with her. And I find it extraordinary. The White Lodgers know exactly who their teachers are talking about when they say Madam.
The whole world did. I mean,
No, but I mean, they still do.
Yeah.
We're talking about 11-year-olds now.
Right.
And when they come into the school, they go, who? They never say that again.
Right.
Because they are immediately told, and it's Madam. And I find that just extraordinary, because that's not, Rambert is no longer referred to as Madam, although she might have been in her life. There's only one Madam.
But also, I mean, the respect for her is worldwide, because I was privileged enough to be in Russia and visited the Diaghilev small exhibition. It's actually Diaghilev's family home in Perm. And there is a wonderful photograph of de Valois. And they were so chuffed when I turned up, because they insisted that I was a pupil of Madam, and they knew her as Madam, and they insisted that I was photographed sort of in the foreground with her in the background, this lovely link. But I mean, they didn't need any, in the backwoods of Siberia, they didn't need any education as to who she was.
That's astonishing, isn't
And
it?
the picture is there.
I'd love, can I just pick up on what you said?
Yes, please. Tell us, and tell us
I
about
was
the
so
archive.
interested what you said. Well, I'd just love to pick up on something Joanna said about the pastoral care that she showed the students.
Absolutely.
When you were doing summer school and she came out to check that you were all right. When she was a member of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, Diaghilev had no state funding. He had to suck up to the great and the good to get any money out of them. So very often, the dancers, and de Valois was a soloist in his company, they would not only have to do the evening performance, but they would then be expected to go straight from the theatre to a private event at a grand house in Paris or Monte Carlo, where they would have to perform again. And she writes, I can't remember which book she writes, they were on their knees. She was so tired, she was practically weeping. And she was equally furious because she realized that it was wicked. They'd had nothing to drink since 10 o'clock that morning. They certainly hadn't had anything to eat. And they were expected to get themselves there, deal with their costumes, and perform until 1 in the morning. And then they would be up next day in class for 10 o'clock. Nobody minded at all about their care, looking after them, paying them properly for a start. And I think that's where that comes from. So that was really interesting.
But also in the book, there's the situation where they're stranded in Belgium at the beginning of the invasion of Belgium at the beginning of the Second World War.
Holland.
And her absolute horror and trying to look after them in an impossible situation.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary chapter in the book.
That's Holland.
That's Holland.
They were on the second last boat out of Holland.
That's right.
You have that
yes.
there.
Yes. Would you like
Flavour.
those few people who haven't read her autobiography, this will be new to, but I'll read a very short excerpt of her account. It's a wonderful account, takes several pages of their experience, terrible experience in Holland, of bullets whizzing past and bombs falling and them having nothing to eat and having to get out. This was when they were in Holland, because the predecessor of the Arts Council, the British Council, had decided to send a company to Holland at the very beginning of the war, it was 1940, as a PR exercise, an anti-Nazi exercise, when the Nazis were just about to invade. The ballet company was chosen to go to Holland to dance, and they did dance in various places, but in the end they had to get out. And this is what she wrote about them coming home. And they eventually got a boat. The company settled themselves in the straw on the dimly lit hold. Frederick Ashton checked each group with me. The congestion was such that it was necessary to walk across outstretched bodies, fumbling for a clear space on which to place one's foot. I lay down at last in the new dinner jacket. That was Fred's new dinner jacket. And Fred handed me 2 handfuls of straw to make a pillow. I felt like a horse about to be fed. A hazardous journey started across the North Sea that lasted for 15 hours. About mid-morning, we were allowed up on deck for some fresh air. By then, 2 graceful silver-grey escorting destroyers were making wide patrolling circles around us. Sea breezes, though for us did not last long, enemy aircraft were spotted overhead, and we were ordered back into the hold. We reached Harwich just before dark on the evening of that never-to-be-forgotten Whit Monday. Already docked was the ship that brought Queen Wilhelmina and the British Embassy over, and 2 fussy tugs steamed to and fro between us and the mainland. It was suddenly all over, and we were on shore. Tea and sandwiches were passed on to us by the WVS helpers, and a train waited to take us to London. Now, extraordinarily enough, that episode is continued in a book by Christopher Fitzsimon, who happens to be my husband, but that's not why I'm saying it. He edited a book of Tyrone Guthrie's letters, which came out recently. Tyrone Guthrie was in charge during the war of the Sadler's Wells Ballet, the Sadler's Wells Opera Company, and the Old Vic Drama Company. Although Madam, of course, was in charge individually of the ballet company. But Tyrone Guthrie was a tremendous letter writer, and he wrote home either to his mother or to his sister, describing all sorts of events in the war. And this is one that he wrote, and perhaps Christopher would like, I don't know if you can see there.
I can see very well.
Can you?
Slightly. At 1 a.m. in Liverpool Street Station, the train still hadn't left Harwich. Hundreds of refugees to be landed and passed through customs. At 2 a.m. we were all instructed. I'll have to come down and
Yeah, why don't you come into the light?
At 2 a.m. we all mustered at the barrier, knotted out on the platform. The station was by now completely silent and empty, and of course, eerily, deadly dark. Policemen arrived, and detectives,
I must tell you about something that's in the Royal Ballet School archives, which is
Yes, do.
completely pertinent to all of this. It involves Tyrone Guthrie and Jill Gregory. And Jill Gregory is a name you probably know. She was one of the original little pupils at the Abbey Theatre, Dublin, the ballet school, the School of Ballet that de Valois set up with W.B. Yeats in 1928. And Jill Gregory, after spending, I think it was 2.5 years training at the Abbey, came over to what was then the Sadler's Wells Ballet School in London, and was one of the youngest members of that company who was sent out to Holland. It is an extraordinary story because we think, and I haven't yet followed this up in the archives, but I would like to, that the British Council were perfectly aware of the fact that the Nazi invasion was highly likely to take place while the dancers were there, but they couldn't withdraw them from the tour, although they knew they were sending them into the lion's jaws, because it would have signalled to the Nazis that they were aware. So they really did go in. It is very likely, I don't have proof of this yet, but circumstantial evidence suggests that they were really lambs to the slaughter. They were incredibly lucky to get out. They left all the costumes and scenery behind. It was a really close shave. And we, you know,
well, they left
our
personal
British ballet.
possessions, didn't they? Because that's why de Valois is actually wearing Fred's dinner jacket.
Absolutely right, yes. But for a young company as well, to lose all those costumes and sets, it set them back mightily because they didn't have the money to replace them. Anyway, they all survived. But young Jill Gregory, in the archives at the Royal Ballet School, we have the letters, the correspondence between Jill Gregory's parents and Tyrone Guthrie. So first of all, it's Guthrie who writes to the parents to say, well, we don't want to worry you unduly, but we haven't actually, this is clearly after the invasion has happened, we haven't actually heard anything back from the company yet. And then the next day, another letter, and the next day, another letter, and he has to confess to these parents in the letters that, in fact, yes, their very young daughter is trapped now behind enemy lines, and is part of a great escape. But of course in London they've no idea what's happening. So yes, one of the great riches of the collections is this wonderful little correspondence. So it's fantastic to hear about the work you've been doing.
Yes, Guthrie had to make the arrangements on behalf of the ballet company with the British Council, and he referred to the civil servants as the gentlemen in striped suits, and he said they knew nothing. They expected the company to go on in each theatre every night. It was one-night stands without rehearsal or without anything. And they said to Tyrone Guthrie, but surely you don't need to rehearse. Haven't you done it before?
Yes. 'Twas ever thus, it's still the same thing.
What I would like to know, have you discovered anything in the archive about what was left behind? Because a lot of the music scores, some of them unique in handwritten music scores, were left behind. Were they retrieved at the end of the war, or were they a goner?
No, nothing was retrieved at the end of the war, no. But we don't particularly have anything in the archive. One thing we do have is a wonderful photograph of de Valois meeting Audrey Hepburn, not too long after the war. And she refers to it in one of her books and says what a beautiful child she was. But the photograph is very touching because, of course, Hepburn had suffered terribly in that last war. After the Battle of Arnhem, there was that winter of starvation in Holland. And she was one of the ones who really nearly didn't make it through. So this very beautiful elfin child, de Valois associated her with what they had just missed by a squeak. And so it's some rather touching photographs. And of course, Hepburn wanted to be a ballet dancer, and the war put paid to that.
Sorry, can I just ask a question in terms of lessons? Beyond what we have in terms of come down to me as a recollection of her upbringing in lesson, is there anything else in the archives
well, for a start,
to that?
Well, she wrote 3 volumes of autobiography. So there's the Invitation, which is 1937. Then there's, she writes them very at organised intervals, being her. So there's Come Dance With Me in 57, and in 77 there's Step by Step. And in all of those, she does look back to an extent at Ireland. But was it you that said, Joanna, she was intensely personal, and she remains incredibly elusive. And I think we saw yesterday in the wonderful performance that you did with Denise that she reveals herself mostly, I think, most personally in her poetry. So if you really know what she wants to think, I mean, there are lovely lyrical passages in her 3 volumes of autobiography, but there's an awful lot of theory in there as well. She would never have called herself a theorist, but she was, in fact. If you read what she's saying, she's theorizing about how you should train, how you should develop a repertoire.
Yep.
Also, these are what you would now call a theorist. So tantalizingly little is revealed about herself and her personality. She makes it quite plain where her heart lies, but it's in the poetry that she really does reveal herself, and in the work, her choreographies as well. So not that much of her choreography still exists, and some still exists, or tantalizing bits of it on film. But even if you look at her choice of music, her choice of designers, she reveals a huge amount of herself through her work.
But last year, so 1905, 1907, and I would like to know if I've got maybe visitations back by the family, because the property of Valois wasn't sold until the late 30s, 1930s and into the 40s. And what was the state of play in terms of the house from the point of view of being rented, whether you could go back using it as a summer house, and any other details?
I don't know. Well, it's the wonderful Jim Corley, who is collating a lot of... Doesn't he? I have you?
Yeah.
Okay.
As far as I know, they just didn't come back. And my grandfather's name was Trevor, but I rang up my cousin before the meeting, find out if he had any papers on my grandfather selling the house.
Do you know that story that we discovered when we went to Rossborough House? That Madam had been invited as a guest to dinner there in the 50s, I think it was 55. And they were all having dinner and they were sitting around. And she looked at the glass and she was like, and eventually they said, you like the glass? And she said, well, actually, these used to be at Baltiboys. And they had been sold, and the people at the Bites, or whoever it was at the time, had gone, bought them at auction in London and brought them back. So they're in Rossborough House and they're still there now. These glasses that were at Baltiboys. And
that's
the
amazing.
mother had written about them in one of her publications.
Just one of the opinions on form in terms of the research I've done is in fact that period of time from 0 to 7, which is considered to be one of the most formative periods in a child's life, because it tends to go from 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, being psychological developments, right? And in reading her Come Dance With Me, looking at some of the characters which in fact she talks about, they obviously were portrayed right through her life as part of who she was.
Oh, yes.
There's no doubt about it. And I will say it's a fairly comprehensive expression of who she is within that. And I was just wondering if there was any more archival material in your own records as part of that.
Well, as part of the Stannis family has placed the family collection with the Royal Ballet School archive, and there are some short stories that she wrote that I haven't actually yet engaged with. I mean, it's the frustrating thing about being an archivist. You allow everybody else to come in and you spend your whole time sort of giving everybody else what it is they want to look at. And there's quite a lot of them as well. There's a whole volume. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there are some stories in there that tell us about, yes. I thought he placed everything that he had. Oh, okay. Ah, right.
He said, no, it's all thrown out with me. I said, but have you got anything? He said, yes, somewhere in a box.
Yes, yes. keep chipping away. Yes.
Could I just come back to the poetry? Because it was a labour of love to dramatise the poetry. And as you would expect from a dance, that there was wonderful cadence and musicality in the poetry.
Yeah.
But it didn't end there. Her talents, the books she's written, they're not just a chronicle. They are beautifully written. The prose, the rhythms. And I try to instill into writers that you have to have these cadences in writing, because everybody's speech has a rhythm. I think there was a choreographer in the 40s called Jack Cape, who said that the performance arts are time arts, because when you speak and when you perform and when you play music, it has to be in such a way that you know when it's going to begin, you know you're roughly in the middle, and you certainly should know when something is about to end because of the cadences. And her writing has that, and her books are stunning.
But if you look, many of the chapters in her books are headed by a quote from often 19th century writers. And she talks about, I don't think it was the library at Bolterboys, because she probably would have been too young. So I think this is probably her grandmother's library in
Walmer.
In Walmer in Kent. But she, I think she speaks about it, anyway, not sure. But I think it was the home where she was living. And she speaks about sort of going into the library and just working her way through everything, you know, copies of Punch, just everything. Some of it, you know, probably completely unsuitable, because she's sitting there in a gentleman's library, or would have been thought unsuitable. But she's just voracious, and you can see the extent of her reading from the quotes that she chooses at the top of her chapters. I find that very interesting, and it's a sort of reading that you only now do if you go to Oxbridge to study English. It's not the normal lexicon of reading that a very bright child will do now. It is very rooted in the 19th century, but it gives her this wonderful use of language.
Yes, the language we're now destroying.
Well, it changes. Language changes.
Well, there's change in the
What did she say in that interview? We must accept change. I wrote it down. She's absolutely like that.
Yes, if it's acceptable change.
That's right.
You're so right, she wouldn't have done Facebook.
No.
She would
She
hate
would have
it.
had time.
She used to say to me, Lucy, you know why we don't drive, don't you? We both be dead. And I had to do therapy with my driving instructor, so you know my great aunt. She told me I'll be dead if I drive. Listen, look at that person over there, stupid woman over there. She can drive, you can. So I told her she learned to drive, she can be dead.
Can we go to Stephen? You've hardly spoken. Can you tell us, let's come forward to now from the past.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I'm second generation. If Joanna would be first generation, all my teachers were taught by De Valois or De Valois generation. My big teacher, I suppose, was Christopher Gable when I was at Central School of Ballet, who's a Royal Ballet project. But I mean, at Bush Davis.
I did with Christopher Gable.
You did
In
part
the
of that?
school,
Well,
yeah.
he was one of your colleagues.
Exactly.
But I mean, at Bush, I was at Bush Davis, which was a boarding school before I went to Central. And it used to be like, it was like the arrival of the Queen, because De Valois would arrive once a year to see the school show. Or, I didn't think she made it every year, but I remember when she did come, and we were all very aware that the Queen was in the building, you know, and she would be brought in, and then the show would start. And there was my mother had a tiny little piece of paper, and I'm not convinced, but it says on it, he does it rather well. And that was sent by one of the teachers to my mum. That was supposed to be about Stephen doing Captain Hook in Peter Pan. So he does it rather well. Anyway, but that's my personal story about De Valois. And the other one I can give you, and again, it's, you know, it was my colleague, my mate at Bush was Michael Nunn, who's gone on to do Ballet Boys. But when he went into the Royal Ballet School, he was involved in his second year there in the upper school. He was in Sleeping Beauty. And he got me a ticket, and I was in for one of these dress rehearsals, in a morning dress rehearsal. And the only people practically in the opera house were the photographers, and I was just fascinated the whole time, because they were doing, everyone was dancing around, and then suddenly you get click, and they would all pick up the cameras at the right moment, and then they'd just watch, and it's like these people were so used to taking photographs. And then suddenly there was nothing, like in an empty auditorium with photographers. And then they all started standing up, and Madam had walked in, and it was like arrival of the Queen. And the rehearsal carried on, nobody stopped But everybody in the auditorium, everything stopped, and everyone was standing, and she just kind of, at the time she had 6, and she just walked in, and that's how she was. So I grew up in the generation where everybody at ballet school knew who she was. She was a permeating influence in all of us. De Valois was the queen of ballet. I was talking to, I think, with Lawrence, we were saying, like a Bush Davis, for example, it wasn't the same at Central, but Bush Davis, it was quite examination orientated. We did Royal Academy of Dancing, we did Imperial Society of Dancing, but they were just examination classes, and the rest of it was just free classes, open classes. And often you'd get somebody who had been at the TTC, the training course at the Royal Ballet School, teaching, or you'd get an ex-dancer from Royal Ballet teaching, and they would just teach free open classes, and then there would be, oh, here's one of Madam's exercises, and then it would be this footwork that Joanne was talking about. And it was, I kind of wonder, I mean, I don't know, but I wonder, when, Cecchetti wrote down the days of the week, but that was when he was getting on, and he didn't really teach the same class every day of the week. No. It was just when he was getting on, he wanted to cover, say, pirouettes on a Wednesday or Grand Allegro on a Wednesday. So he used to cover, so he wasn't strictly, that has now become the method. And it was kind of, I wonder if, when you're teaching, I know other teachers who have done it, they kind of have classes that they do over a period of time so that they know they can come back to it and that things get covered. And I wonder, but I mean, there were definite De Valois. I always remember one, I'm going to World Dancers here, there's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Remember this one? Super so changement and a trois assemblée and a cat and a cinq assemblée and a six. And then you do it with the front foot and then you do it with the back foot. That was all very typical De Valois stuff.
It's known as knitting, I mean.
And all teachers used to do that. You'd stand there and then the teacher would sit on their hands and say, we'll have a pirouette, we'll have a pas de bourrée dessous. And you're trying to work out, was that dessous or dessous? Because none of us can say the difference between dessous and dessous. You know what I mean? Under and over, you know what I mean? It was all of these things. And
it was the reversing it.
The reversing it. But that's a De Valois thing as well. I mean, all of this fiddly stuff.
And then do it going backwards.
Well, that's developing the brain as well.
It's brilliant.
As well as the feet, isn't it? It's making you a bright, turned on, switched on, awake dancer.
But you could do it. And
you can't just sort of settle back. It's this whole thing of within the Royal Ballet School, you're never allowed to lounge on the bar.
No.
And that comes from Madden. You don't,
it's a bar
during class, you do not rest back on the bar at all. It's because you've got to sort of be engaged in the room.
Totally.
But just 2 points that I was thinking there. First of all, she devised her syllabus not as something that was for training dancers. I know this sounds perverse, but she devised it to teach teachers how to teach. Right. Because exactly as you say, to make sure they covered everything, because this 300-year-old vocabulary is very old and very broad, and you can sort of forget or leave aside, oh, everyone's too tired today, we're not going to do those tricky things. So she made sure that everything was encompassed, and also all that knitting you're talking about, it was because her chief choreographer, yes, she was very precise as a dancer, that's the sort of language she felt comfortable with as a dancer. But Ashton uses it.
Ashton, absolutely.
And so she was training dancers to dance Ashton.
Every teacher used to do it. Every teacher would have you knitting with your feet.
Fancy because they knew that it woke you up.
That's what you needed. It was the start. Yes. And there was something else that there was, and again it's anecdotal. I mean, everybody knows all the anecdotes, but there was something about how De Valois used to make the girls dress in tweeds because it wasn't quite respectable to be a dancer.
No.
And so when we're trying to establish, the ballet company, whatever, the girls were all required to dress in twin set and that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Just to kind of
that
make
had
it
gone
look.
in my day, but I know when I was with the company that you were not expected to walk out of the stage door in jeans and a t-shirt. I mean, appearances were to be kept up.
Well, I mean, to be honest, when De Valois started working in the professional theatre with the Wonder Children that she talked about in the clip that we heard, just before the First World War, sort of 1913. Basically, being a ballet dancer was tantamount to being a prostitute.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it absolutely was. And the first partners that she was working with were females in travesty. So it wasn't until she got to the Lyceum Pantomime in London, which was a huge, big budget affair, that she actually danced with a male partner. if you look at very early pictures of her, she's dancing with people like Doris Murray and Noreen Feist, who are these travesty dancers. And of course, it goes back into the 19th century, and it's a wonderful opportunity for the chaps in the audience to have a great time looking at girls' legs. And, you know, lots of low necklines and things. And when she was, the Empire Theatre, for example, it had the promenade at the back where the ladies of the night would ply their trade while Madeleine Genet, the porcelain princess, was doing her ballet up on stage. So there was always this pull between excellence, witnessed in somebody like Genet or Pavlova, in the context of something, you know, really low, rackety, knockabout, quite a dangerous environment for young women, not to put
That's, I think, possibly
it
why
too
she
mildly.
was so keen that we should all be actually very well academically educated.
Exactly.
With the Royal
That's
Ballet School.
exactly what she's counteracting.
Exactly.
So can I just there's a lovely little story in when de Valois made a ballet for Rambert, the Bar of
Valois, yeah.
And she's sort of in Soho with Alicia Alice Marks, and they're kind of in a cab. She brings Alice Marks out to see the working girls in Soho, so that Alicia Marks can observe some of the nuances to put into her performance when she's dancing as the can-can dance, you know, which I think is wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant.
What is the story of the Paris Opera rats?
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us a bit about those?
Well, I mean, it is that tradition.
The lowest of the low.
Yeah, I mean, one absolutely critical thing to say is, and this is relevant to what you've just asked, when she set up her school in 1926, there was no indigenous British national ballet. It didn't exist. So, whereas in France, and you know, coming up through Italy, and then from France being translated to Russia, in the 17th, particularly the early 18th century, these schools had been established. So the little rats that you're talking about, the young children of the Paris Opera Ballet, that was a tradition that went right back into the early 18th century.
I believe one of the reasons for them being called rats was because they were in there day and night. Yes, and because they were scrawny little things. Yeah, absolutely,
yes.
absolutely.
But they were, I mean, you just have to look at the Degas, you know, the little dancer in her fourth position with the, I mean, when there was a recent exhibition in London, her background was given. She basically came from a family of dancers, and the girls came from very humble backgrounds, and they earned their living meeting the gentlemen after the show in the Foyer de la Danse.
But it's all in Degas, all of those Degas.
Absolutely. I mean, that was the life of a dancer, and that was what de Valois was. Yeah. She was determined to make it a respectable, properly paid profession, and also so that it would attract men. Because, you know, this whole business of women dancing in travesty and things, no self-respecting man would go in it, and no father would want his son to go into this profession. So she had a terrible time recruiting men, so she had to make the profession a respectable one. But it didn't at all mean she was a prude. She knew exactly what was going on.
In Soho.
In Soho, yes.
Lawrence, would you like to put us in the picture what I think Paul Johnson was going to say if he'd been here?
Yes, I'll take Paul's
collaborative.
question, and it should bring up some lively discussion. Paul said that in contemporary arts practice, we don't seem to use the label interpretive as much. We talk about being collaborators and creative artists. Where do we stand on that, and what would have been de Valois' stance?
There's that lovely film of recent, where she's coaching Swan with, is it Margaret Porter?
Yes, Margaret Porter.
And it was kind of a sneaky film. Well, it wasn't a sneaky film, but Margaret Porter was being coached by Madame in Swan and asked if she could. And you've got, it's not a wonderful film to look at, but it is a wonderful film to look at, but not from a film, because you see that process of teacher and pupil, or passing it on, all of the process that happens in ballet studios, which isn't about teaching steps, you know, it's where you have those wonderful moments where people are actually talking about the importance of the eyelashes, or it's very small things that you go over and over and over, and that would be, is that collaboration where you're coaching somebody to do something, you're giving them experience? Is that interpretation of Margaret Porter seeing?
It's a
that process.
It's a very thin line.
But in ballet, the process is always they that have experienced passing on something again. So it's like it's never really. I don't think it's ever really imitated. You're done. It's done as your interpretation of what has been given to you.
Yeah.
I think dance is more collaborative.
Right.
And
I think contemporary dance is a different kettle of fish in some areas, because you will definitely have a collaboration and the dancers will have a definite choreographic input into it. But I don't think that is so much the case. I think it doesn't happen that way in ballet.
I can define it a little more to put it in perspective for people who are not in the dance world. As I said, the dance and theatre is very collaborative. And from an actor's point of view, in film, the actor interprets the part, but you're the absolute puppet of the director. And I read an article recently that film is one of the greatest collaborative arts. And when you go on set, you turn up, it's like the old days of rep, you turn up, you learn your lines, you don't bump into the camera, you take your 50p and you go home. That is not a collaborative art. And to me, film has become a director and a designers and a producers.
But they're collaborating.
Yes, and control. And you have very little say sometimes, even over your performance, because you've worked out your performance and you're told, no, I don't like that, no, I don't like that. That's not collaborative. So I think theatre and ballet
it's with that process. If you're an actor and you get hold of a script and you learn your words, you can say your words. That would be the equivalent of a dancer looking at a video and learning the steps. But that, knowing your steps, it's massive. It's same as knowing
it's not
the
just
words.
saying the words.
It's massive.
The performer has to get into the head.
So, and it's that process. For every, every 2 minutes on stage, it takes 2 hours of rehearsal or something.
Well, I mean, I'll give you a small example.
In terms of the interpretive aspect of it,
I think we should look at Yeats and Ninette de Valois working together, right?
Exactly.
I mean, they came together by way of collaboration, right? But at the end of the day, Yeats allowed her, right, to interpret the art of what his plays were about for dancers. And I think that's a very strongly, in terms of that question, I think actually Ninette obviously agreed with the idea of that. And one of the things she did say to Yeats as part of being involved was that she would never speak on stage, that she would actually dance only, right? And then, of course, the addition of the masks, right, brings in a whole sense of interpretation. And Yeats at the time didn't interfere with her interpretation. And that collaboration arising from that, the interpretation arising from collaboration was a very successful endeavour. And Ninette herself says very clearly that she learned so much in the collaboration in terms of dancing and, as a result, interpretation. And I think that follows her through, right? Because she had been building to that. If you go back to the Cambridge Festival Theatre, right? That's where she was brought on board by her cousin, right? For the purpose of the fact that she had done such a range of things in terms of dancing, and that she was able to use that experience, the breadth of that experience, to interpret what he wanted. And because they were all in the area of that expressionist period, right? And of course in Paris and so on. And that's where she was coming from. So in terms of the question you asked, Lawrence, my sense for it is, in fact, that yes, she would have agreed with the interpretation. And that was very much a part of her life as she was going forward.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I agree with absolutely everything you said. I think of her much more as a collaborator than an interpreter. I don't know where to begin on this, really. Just very quickly with the word interpretation. With de Valois, she was quite rude, for example, about the work of Isadora Duncan. She did not rate Isadora Duncan because she felt, and to be fair, she only saw Duncan in the 20s when Duncan was already alcoholic and really, we would now say, pretty mentally unwell after all the awful things that had happened to her. She felt that to be all interpretive, because Duncan worked with great music, that was one of her great innovations, but she interpreted it freely. And de Valois just felt, in the lovely word that she would use, a cul-de-sac. It was a dead end. it couldn't go anywhere. So you could splurge your emotions all over the place, but that was no good unless it was underpinned, I suppose, by a technique, by a tradition, by a discipline, by a form and a structure. Yes, indeed. Yes, it's military, but I don't think one should... That is a very important aspect of it, and an analogy with military discipline and structure is absolutely deeply embedded in the ballet de corps, the early history of dance. But I don't think one should think that that is the whole story. It's part of her personality, and it's partly embedded in the form of classical ballet, and it is important, but it's not the whole story. I would say I would treat the word interpretation with caution in relation to de Valois, but for me she's absolutely a collaborator, and I find this quite interesting because people always think of her as Madam. James Monaghan, the dance writer, referred to her as the General. I don't know if you... in fact, it was Terence Gray at the Cambridge Theatre, Norman Marshall, his stage manager, referred to her rather disparagingly, I think, as the games mistress. She was given all of these titles which indicate that she was sort of on her own, doing her own thing. But actually you look, and her whole life is one of collaborations. And often yes, they were incredibly creative collaborations. So let's talk about the Camargo Society, because you were Arnold Haskell yesterday, and Arnold founded the Camargo Society with P.J.S. Richardson, and it's a committee which included John Maynard Keynes as well, so pretty high-powered committee of very educated, motivated people. De Valois knew how to operate with committees in a collaborative way to practically get something done, but to join and to form the right sort of committee so it's going to enable creativity.
You're taking a point here which is to do with the idea of collaboration on an administrative level, right? And she was a very good team player, right, in terms of that.
Absolutely. She was a genius administrator.
If you go back to when, in fact, she first danced that particular jig in that place with the music, right, and she interpreted. Take her time when she was in Deal with her grandmother Fanny, right, and her writing the small plays, when in fact she performed them for the entertainment of her brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
I would actually say, in fact, that she, in her dancing career, she was very interpretive, right? She became much more, I'm not saying you can't say, you're interpretive and you're not collaborative. I'm saying, in fact, that the interpretive element of who she was very clear. It became more collaborative as she developed going forward. And she became a great manageress of, one of the great executives who was able to pull a team together and be able to sort of perform and bring the ballet to where it was. So I wouldn't go with the idea of sort of dismissing, I'm not saying you are, but diminishing even the whole idea of the interpretive aspect of what she was about. Because I'm quite clear in my reading of her that she was very strong in the interpretive side of things.
But what is she interpreting? I mean, my analogy with Duncan was interpreting music through her body. What was she interpreting? What was de Valois
The
interpreting?
Holborn Prince. What was that ballet? Or
Which one?
The Prince. It was the Rex Progress. Sorry.
The Rex Progress.
Yeah. But you mean didn't she go and look at prints, look at paintings? And
Hogarth.
So she's interpreted that.
Yes, she's
The
interpreting
Hogarth.
Hogarth. You're absolutely right. Or
And
with
she's
Job,
doing
she's
that,
interpreting
but she
Blake.
also, I remember seeing something where she would walk into a studio, having done her interpretation, and go into the studio knowing exactly what she was going to do in the studio. You know what I mean?
Yes, she would.
I would say this is what, and she'd worked out Fraser's music, she'd worked out passage of choreography. It was done not in the way that some choreographers will walk into a studio and create on what they see in front of them. She didn't do that. She came in. So the interpretation as such was done before she walked in.
Yes, so it's you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's the question that needs to be answered. What is she interpreting? And you are right. She's often interpreting visual sources like Hogarth or Blake, as opposed to somebody like Ashton, who's much freer and who loved Duncan, incidentally, who was interpreting music. And you're right, the way that she interpreted was then to pin it down.
Yeah.
Totally. And so that's something else we've got in the archives. For example, with the Blake, when she did William
Job.
Blake's Book of Job in 1931, she sat down with the Blake designs and she traced his drawings, and those the formations, the groupings in Yeats' work, Blake's work, she then literally transposes into the structure of her choreography. And she actually, sometimes she handwrites notes, but sometimes she literally types them. She pins it down to such an extent.
There's some wonderful footage of her rehearsing, I think, a programme that David Bintley did for BBC, and Madam was a considerable age at that point, and they were doing, Birmingham Royal Ballet were doing a revival of Checkmate, I think, and there's a bit of footage of Madam in rehearsal, and it's not exactly as she wanted, and she is up there on the stage, no, you know,
Yes.
She knew exactly how it should be, and she was going to, you know, they weren't to deviate from that at all.
Yes, it's I think it was done in the early 80s, and it's Margaret Barbieri, who's the Black Queen. And the lovely dancer we saw dance at Rusborough.
Zoe Ash-Brown.
Zoe, yes, she did.
She did that
for the
Monica
conference here. Monica coached her in that. That was so lovely to see. But de Valois gives Margaret Barbieri a really hard time because she does not want Barbieri to impose her own interpretation. She does not want her to do that. She wants her to be Black Queen as her Black Queen. And, you know, at one point she says, stop emoting. I don't want you to emote. Just do the movement.
I mean, that's why she was completely different from Ashton, because Ashton gave a lot of leeway and Ashton took from...
In a way that ties in with the mask thing. I can't imagine how it would have been to dance in a mask. Yeah. You know, but that would have been just physical language, and so the emoting is to a minimum. You know what I mean? Emoting.
But her bigger collaboration, I think, was on the broader scale, that she had also, with the Diaghilev background, which she would collaborate with artists, with musicians, with costume designers. That was the broad scale of the collaboration. But when it came to the actual choreography, it was absolutely precise.
Yes.
Yeats was originally looking at his plays, his dance plays, and he had the Japanese, right, interpretive artists, right? And it was only when, in fact, he had heard or seen the performance by Ninette in terms of Ambolia Strand, that he was really impressed with the fact that he'd come close to the idea of what that particular genre, that artist was about. Right?
Well, I think he needed her because she had the physical language. He didn't have the physical language that he needed for his vision. And when he saw her work for at the Cambridge Theatre, he realised that this woman did, and he needed an intelligence behind that language.
Yeah, I hear that, but the point I'm making, I suppose, is in fact that I don't consider to be a free-flow interpretist, right? But I do consider to be an interpretive artist within the context of a structure, which you've mentioned yourself, right? Yeah. But she definitely brought life to some of the visions that Yeats had, and he was very, very pleased, because that collaboration and interpretation lasted for the period of 1928 to 1934. That's 6 years, you know, and I don't think Yeats suffered through us too often, no more than she did.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the ideal world, that the dancer, the actor, the performer interprets, the director or the choreographer interprets, and there has to be collaboration. Yeah. There has to be a halfway house somewhere. Nobody can say, this is the way I'm going to interpret it, this is the way I'm going to choreograph it. It has to be a meeting of minds, and in a real ideal world, which very rarely happens, that should be the collaborative process, and on occasions that does come together. But I think when Paul brought this up, we are losing this, and we're getting performers. I certainly know there are actors and actresses, and I still call them actresses because I like to define. There are actors and actresses who say, well, I'm not a performer, I'm an interpretive artist, and others say, well, yes, I'm a performer and I interpret pieces. You know, it's getting very, very smudged.
I think as well, so with de Valois, and again, it's my limited knowledge, but like the process that she went through between, say, the 20s and the 40s, and when she was doing choreography-ish, might have changed. And how much do we know about that? I mean, all I can say is I've seen the study which Beth Jenny did, the American, on the work that she did on that ballet, Bar of Folie Bergère. And there, I think it's in the Romberg archive, it's extant, the notes, that, and the kind of notes that de Valois left are sort of 4 measures of music, girl moves from right to left. So everything was kind of worked out at that period. This is 1934, I think, 34.
Yeah, it was 34.
So, but you know what I mean? But I think that she would have walked in, and she was making a ballet for Ballet Romba, the Mercury Theatre, a small, you know, the ballet club. So it was a theatre this size, and that kind of, and she was working with the dancers she had, and so I think the collaboration would have been looking at the material she's got, going home, perhaps sitting down, working out what she was going to do the next day, and coming in and doing it. So in that way, there's that, you know.
So hand in hand.
And so where does one start? You know what I mean?
Yes,
there's no way that her brain necessarily worked differently from anybody else. It just was just very, very, very amazing the way it worked her way. I mean, she's got this. I don't.
Yeah, no, you're right. And what Joanna, what you said about the Diaghilev collaborations being her template,
I think so.
like. Oh, absolutely, without question. And the Diaghilev, of course, worked with mostly Russian collaborators. And
although by the time de Valois was with the company, they were mostly French because the revolutions happened back in Russia, and it was less. I mean, there were Russian emigres, of course.
Yeah.
But it was a wonderful mixture. I mean, if you think of all those contemporary composers.
Yes, but when she was there, she was predominantly working with Nijinsky, who was working with Stravinsky. There was Massine still around. They were doing folking reps. So you're completely right. They were using all the French modernists.
But I mean, she would have been aware after she left of how it was.
But my point being that they had consciously set out to work with Russian collaborators, certainly in the first 10 years of their existence. And in trying to establish a national company, she was trying to consciously work with British collaborators.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, she did make the odd exception, so Checkmate was designed by an American, but he was an American who was designing posters for London Underground. So he was working in England. But yes, so, you know, people like Gwen Raverett and Vaughan Williams and Rex Whistler and Gavin Gordon, they're all English, British.
And then when the company is established
in
its own way, then she's bringing back in some of the Russian collaborators to do Firebird and reproduce that repertoire.
Yes.
I think...
may I just make one point? When you go back to the Ballet Route, you're talking about collaboration. You're talking about an extraordinary period. Who were their designers and costume designers? You had Miro, Chagall, Picasso, Salvador Dali, and so on. I mean, that was an extraordinary period. How can you compare that period, which was the beginning of Madame's collaboration? My connection is I lived with Léonette Massine's family for 6 years in Paris, and I know more on his side, but a lot of the ballets you had extraordinary artists. The collaboration was there. I mean, I've seen some of the drawings of Salvador Dali for various things. Absolutely. I mean, has there been a period like that in the history of ballet since then? I asked the question because, I mean, this was an extraordinary period.
Well, not really, because I think the profession of theatre designer now has become separate. So, for example, somebody like Ashley Page commissioned Howard Hodgkin to do a work, but which was, I remember it was an astonishing backdrop. But the work itself, as a ballet, didn't survive. So that, you know, fascinating collaboration in terms of visual design didn't last. Richard Alston choreographed something, and it was designed by Catherine Hamnett, you know, the famous haute couturier. So there have been collaborations, and people like Wayne McGregor work with contemporary designers, sort of people, architects, but the whole landscape has shifted so much. So now that, you know, the profession of theatre designer is much more a thing in itself, and they're dealing with really complicated lighting and things flying in and out. So it's much harder, just inverted commas, to collaborate with the equivalent of a Picasso or a Derain now, because those people are busy doing the Venice Biennale, and they're not necessarily collaborative in their own approach. I mean, imagine trying to design a ballet with Tracy Emin. I mean, it'd be impossible. How could you possibly pin her down? Do you see? There is a degree of practicality, and that's why you needed Diaghilev acting like
Yes.
the
But it
producer,
wasn't that
pulling,
was a
you know,
catalyst.
banging all their heads together
But
and
that-
say, "You do this." If you don't,
That was exactly the thing.
Yeah.
It was Diaghilev was the genius with that, well,
Yeah.
that made everything support each other. Like everything was great because the three things or the four things were working together, not just the one was a statement.
Yeah.
You know, often now, people will make a statement about their painting or their design, which is bigger than the dance or bigger than the music.
Yeah.
And that's why
Yeah.
things don't survive.
Exactly.
It's where the balance was.
It seems to me, from what all of you have been saying, what strikes me is that Ninette de Valois was born at exactly the right moment. And that Diaghilev was at the right stage,
Yes.
and everything was at the right stage. And at the end of the war, when she'd had this very mixed experience, that Covent Garden couldn't get an opera company together, so they had to get the ballet. And that's how she landed up being the Covent Garden Ballet.
I wonder though, with some of
It
those
was all-
personalities, you think, what would they have done now? I mean, some personalities could make anything happen at any point in time. It's just that we're looking from retrospect and saying that's why it worked. But that personality in a different circumstance would have created something great.
About how in the world these geniuses would pop up, and it was a rare thing, like a 17 years space, and then another talent would arrive in the world. That the sort of extraordinariness of genius arriving in the world, you think there are many, but there aren't. And the timing is... She had a theory about that.
I don't know. Well, she was always making her own agency, her own, her own role, if you like, recede into the background and saying, it takes more than one to make a company. She would get very cross when people singled her out. But actually, if you look and say, yes, she absolutely was born at the right time, but Rambert was also a contemporary, started out with she started her own school 6 years before de Valois did. Rambert couldn't have built the National Ballet.
No, because Rambert's background was totally different. I mean,
Yes.
Rambert's classical ballet background was minimal because she'd been brought into
But
the
also
Diaghilev,
her personality.
and her personality was different. I mean, I worked with both of them, and they couldn't have been more different.
And then somebody like Mona Inglesby, who started the International Ballet. So there were other people around, but it was she that did it.
Oh, absolutely.
And it was no accident of history.
No, it wasn't.
It needed her.
Definitely.
Because like Diaghilev, who was the only one who could pull those disparate artists together, she was the only one that could pull all the... She called them her architects of, people like Ashton and Fontaine and Lambert and Helpman. She was the only one that could pull them together in the way that she did.
Could I just come back to the nub of Paul's question, because and again, it's not surprising we've gone such a range, to come back down to the performer as being the collaborator or the interpreter, because a painter, the artist, produces something, but the dancer who sees that and is asked to create something from it, he then becomes the interpreter, and the choreographer then has the control. So then who becomes the collaborator within that aspect, that narrow aspect? And this is where the margins are thinning out now. Does the performer then become, are they a collaborative artist or a performance artist? And that's where he says we are getting, the interpretive artist. Because actors, the writers, poets are the creators. We are then the interpreters, and then the choreographers and the directors should become the collaborators, and I think that's what he was trying to get to the centre.
I didn't know the woman, but I'm sure Madam would just turn around and say, let's just get on with it, shall we?
I think so.
I think we've vastly overrun our time, so we really should wrap this up,
Definitely.
unless anybody
Before
wants
we
to
leave,
go on.
can I just say one thing? That from a teacher's point of view, we had Dame Ninette come over here and start the Abbey School. A lot of the teachers that are still teaching today did their training with teachers who had attended the Abbey School. And through that, the tradition is very deeply carried on. And we all, I think I speak for most of the teachers present, even here today, we all have a great graw for her
for what she did, great respect for what she did, and we struggle every week in our ballet schools to try to reproduce as good work as we can possibly do. So that grounding that she said to improve teaching, we do. And on the interpretive side, hopefully our students are ready then as a canvas to be worked with other interpretive artists and choreographers as they progress into the world of dance. Okay.
Pauline, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that sums it up very well.
Excellent.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Just before I formally close, there are apparently few tickets left for tonight. So if you've got any friends and people interested, please do keep spreading the word. And thank you again, Blessington, for hosting this. You have a gem of a heroine, and you must cherish her. Thanks to Stephen G. Brennan, to Joanna Banks, Anne McCower, Anna Meadmore from coming from London. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Vastly over.
Well done, everybody. Well done, Anne.